Final Fantasy VII is a game that needs no introduction, an iconic entry of an iconic series, a leader of a ravenously popular genre, synonymous with one of the most successful consoles of all time, and quite simply considered by millions to be one of the greatest games ever made. Remaking a game is never easy, but when you're remaking a game as historically relevant, beloved, and popular as Final Fantasy VII, that task becomes infinitely more Herculean, and Square Enix certainly aren't backing down from that unenviable task. Their ambitious initiative to remake Final Fantasy VII seems unprecedented. They're rolling the dice and looking to expand on the original like no remake has ever done before, and we're incredibly excited and quite nervous all at the same time. Final Fantasy VII Remake will differ from the game it's inspired by in many, many ways, and here we'll be talking about some of these big differences between the two. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Multiple parts. One of the very first things we found out about Final Fantasy VII Remake was that Square Enix intended to release the game across multiple installments, and that was something they reiterated when they re-revealed the game at last year's E3. While there are many who are concerned about how that will impact the story, or if breaking the game into multiple parts will mean several sections getting dragged out, the developers insist it's quite the opposite. According to Square, in remaking Final Fantasy VII, they're taking the chance to expand upon the promise of the original in every way, from gameplay and narrative to visuals and technology, which means that they're investing a lot more time and resources into various sections of the game, thus the multiple installments. The upcoming release is the first in a series of, well, we don't know how many just yet, but we do know it will be focused entirely on Midgar and the events that transpire there. Story changes. Given how much Square Enix are zooming into Final Fantasy VII with their remake, it goes without saying that the game will make quite a few changes to the story as well. According to the developers, though the larger story beats being followed will mostly be the same as the original game, we should expect to see some tweaks here and there to major events, such as the Mako reactor being blown up by Shinra themselves instead of by Avalanche as revealed in the demo. One change being made to the story in particular is quite intriguing. Sephiroth is in Midgar. When you think of villains in video games, Sephiroth has got to be one of the first names that pops into your head. While he took his sweet time to make his first appearance in the original Final Fantasy VII, in the remake, he's going to be around right from the get-go, even though the original game saw him making an appearance after the events in Midgar. In an interview with IGN, producer Yoshinori Kitase, who directed and wrote the original, said that since everyone knows who Sephiroth is, there's no need for secrecy surrounding his identity anymore, and that the remake will build him up as a constant presence and a major threat to Cloud right from the beginning. New dialogue and events. Beyond the main story sequences and tentpole moments, fans can expect expansions in several other instances as well, as the demo itself showed us clearly enough, which the developers say is representative of this change in the rest of the game as well. Remake is going to flesh out story moments greatly by expanding upon scenes, and by adding dialogue, exchanges, and longer interactions between characters. These exist to give us greater insight into these characters and flesh them out as personalities further, while also providing greater details on the world and several backstories. Similarly, you can also expect several events and new scenes to be added, which will serve to fill in even more meat on the bones of the story, which, as we've already discussed, will remain largely the same. Revamped combat. This is another obvious change, and as such one of the biggest, and based on everything we've seen so far, also the one with the most potential. Where the original Final Fantasy VII was turn-based, the remake is going to feature real-time action combat with a tactical twist. Players attack by pressing square, while the action can be paused at any time to go into a tactical menu to select abilities, magic, items, and more to use. All of that is done through your ATB gauge, which leads us to our next point. Revamped ATB. Active Time Battle, or ATB, was a staple of Final Fantasy during the peak of the series' turn-based era, and even though Final Fantasy VII Remake is not going to be turn-based, it will still feature ATB, albeit a heavily modified version. Your ATB gauge will slowly fill up over time like it did in the original, but in a neat twist, actions during combat, such as attacking enemies, will make it fill up faster. Any items you want to use, any magic spells you want to cast, any special abilities you want to pull off will all cost ATB, at least one chunk of the ATB gauge, while some might require more. Pressured and staggered states. There's plenty of complexity in Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat thanks to various wrinkles and mechanics. The pressured and staggered mechanics, though not exactly new to the series as a whole, in some form or another, are new to Final Fantasy VII. Attacking enemies sees them building up a pressured gauge, which fills up faster if you hit them with attacks they're weak to. Once this gauge fills up, enemies enter the staggered state, where not only are they, well, staggered, but also take significantly more damage. Staggering enemies and then attacking them with the likes of limit breaks or attacks they're weak to is a great strategy, especially for bosses. You'll be very familiar with this system if you've ever played Final Fantasy XIII, and based on what we've played of the remake of Final Fantasy VII, it fits in rather well here as well. Characters in combat. Given Final Fantasy VII's turn-based nature, though characters differed from each other wildly in various ways, how you interacted with them for the purposes of combat was always the same. Final Fantasy VII Remake is going to switch things up significantly, with each of the playable characters having a very unique fighting style, which will each feel and play differently. Cloud is a damage-based attacker. Tifa is more agile and specializes in quick and furious hand-to-hand combos. Barret specializes in long-range attacks and can attack enemies that are out of reach, while Aerith specializes in healing and magical abilities. Given that players will be able to switch between characters during combat on the fly, there should be no lack of variety during battles. Red 13 is not playable. So we've mentioned Cloud, Barret, Tifa, and Aerith, but where's Red 13, we hear you ask? Well, he's in the game, but he's not going to be playable. The wolf-lion-like beast appeared back in the original just as the Midgar section of the story was coming up. Seeing as the remake's first installment will be ending roughly in that zone, Red 13 won't have an awful lot of screen time. He will fight alongside you and your party members during combat, but he will not be a playable character himself. How summons work. We're not done talking about combat mechanics just yet. Summons are a core and integral part of any Final Fantasy game, and how they function in the VII Remake is going to be quite different from how they functioned in the original game. For starters, you'll only be able to use summons in boss fights or certain special fights. Upon meeting certain conditions and using the required material, summons, once, well, summoned, will be controlled by the AI and will fight alongside you autonomously, which they will continue to do until a timer, represented by an on-screen bar, runs out. You will also be able to use your ATB gauge to command summons to perform special attacks and abilities. Expanded boss battles. The boss fights in the earlier section of the original Final Fantasy VII are hardly remembered as the most challenging, which makes sense because they were effectively designed as elaborate tutorials to ease players into the game. However, with the remake focusing only on Midgar for now, it's going to expand boss fights as well, just as it's doing with nearly everything else. We've already seen the boss fight against the Guard Scorpion multiple times in footage. Many of us have even fought it ourselves in the demo, while recent previews have also confirmed that the Airbuster fight has also undergone a major facelift. Based on all that, we wouldn't be surprised to see what were thought of as smaller and less important bosses being given much more prominence in the remake. New and expanded locations. Well, this one is kind of obvious. If Square Enix are focusing on Midgar and nothing else for the entirety of Final Fantasy VII Remake's first installment, it makes sense that they're going to increase the size and scope of the location as well. It would also be in keeping with how they've been treating every other aspect of the game. While very few specifics have been shared so far, Square Enix have confirmed that Final Fantasy VII Remake will not only iterate upon and enhance several Midgar locations from the first game, it'll also add entirely new locations of its its own. It remains to be seen how much of that'll be part of scripted story missions and how much will be optional open world stuff, if the game does indeed end up being fully open world, that is. But it's certainly going to be interesting no matter what they choose to do. Expanded side quests. It's not just the main story that's receiving all the love from Square Enix. It seems they're also focusing quite a bit on side quests. Speaking recently in an interview with Famitsu, the game's director Tetsuya Nomura said that side quests in Final Fantasy VII Remake will be just as high quality as all the main story content. He also revealed that the development team had originally planned on putting many more side quests than what the game ended up having. However, realizing that they couldn't develop that many side quests satisfactorily, they decided instead to focus on a smaller number and thus prioritize quality over quantity. New secondary characters. As we've mentioned, though Final Fantasy VII Remake might fiddle around with a few things here and there, it'll mostly stick to the main story beats of the original. The majority of the new stuff apparently will come from side activities and side quests, which we've also spoken of. In fact, in the aforementioned Famitsu interview, Tetsuya Nomura also confirmed that though there won't be too many new characters in the main story, there are many that will appear in secondary roles in side stories. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, please hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to switch on the notifications bell icon next to it. That way you'll never miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching.